listener production.
In 2011, Newcastle Knights superstar Danny Wicks was under covert surveillance and later arrested for drug trafficking. It all but ruined his career and brought rugby league from the back page to the front page for all the wrong reasons. In this rewind episode of Crime Insiders, former New South Wales Detective Sergeant Craig Semple joins Brent Sanders to share incredible stories from his career. As well as arresting high-profile sports stars, Craig Semple has tackled some of Australia's most vicious and high-profile outlaw motorcycle gangs. We begin in Yamba, on the New South Wales mid-north coast.
Working weekends was an unusual occurrence for me. It was normally Monday to Friday, and sometimes your paperwork gets that piled up. The only way to get on top of it is come in on a weekend when the phones are quiet, and so that's the only reason I was in there that day, as fate turns out. It was down at a place called Yamba. A call came over the radio, and it sounded pretty innocuous. I was about to turn the speaker off because it was interrupting my thoughts with the work I was doing. And one of those things you develop as a cop is an instinct, a sixth sense for things that something's not right. So I travelled down to that job. I didn't really need to be there. They weren't calling for detectives. I just had a feeling something wasn't right with it. There was one other uniformed bloke waiting for me to turn up. He had a couple of blokes with him that looked like suspects to me. So they didn't really check on the victim in there, so we didn't know whether he was alive or dead. So I basically took it upon myself to get in that house. I just had two jobs I had to do. One of those jobs was to get in and make sure no one needed any medical help, and the other job was to get in there and clear that house of danger and make it safe for the cops that I'd call in after me. So I went around the back of the house. The front door was locked, and pulled my gun out. Like I had done many times before, I went through a process. If I had the time to do it before I went into a dangerous situation, I'd sort of psych myself up before I entered, just to get the adrenal system going and fire myself up. So I went through a process of just saying to myself, mate, as soon as you go through that door, if you're confronted with a threat, do not hesitate to pull the trigger, because if you hesitate, you're dead. So basically what happened was I went through that house, and I'm not going to get into the details of how horrific the scene was, but it was pretty graphic. And the house was a crime scene from the back door to the front door. So I went through and I cleared that house at gunpoint, room by room. Basically, when I got to the last room of the house, which is where the victim was, worst of the crime scene, put simply, my system, I was just so flooded with adrenaline. That adrenaline serves to really sharpen all your sensory experiences. So, for me, looking back in hindsight, pumped on adrenaline, colours become brighter, sense of hearing, touch, smell, even the things I could taste in the air in that house, they become really acute, and it sort of burn in deep, all those experiences, and served to scramble the way my brain processed everything that happened in that house that day, all those sensory experiences. So that's what ended up causing what I see as a clearly defining point with PTSD for me at that point in time. So it was a pretty horrific scene, but when it comes to the scale of horror, of the things I'd seen in the cops, it wasn't up there with the worst. It was more the state that I was in, the state of arousal that I was in at the time I was exposed to it, which caused the problems. And this is the important part about education for cops out there is, if you're not educated, how are you going to know? So that's an important part.
And so you then become the officer in charge of that homicide investigation. So you're on scene, and like you say, it was a pretty horrendous scene. Somebody shot at close range with a shotgun. We can imagine the scene. And the first 24, 48 hours of an investigation like that, how does that look moving forward from that point? How does that process open up and roll forward?
So the very first thing for me is crime scene preservation, delegating that task to the uniformed bloke that was there and making sure that he had it taped off and made sure he kept logs and all those sort of things, make sure we restricted who went in and out. The two blokes who actually came across the victim, who were friends with him, we had to take them in, keep them separated, do separate interviews with them so they couldn't cross-contaminate each other's stories. We had forensic police come in and do gunshot residue tests on their hands and clothing just to make sure that they, because these guys were pretty soon dismissed as suspects, and they were then witnesses. So, but we had to definitively write them off as far as suspects and do all that sort of work. So there's a lot of work went in just that side of it. And then one of the victim's flatmates that he was living with in that house, he had disappeared, and so had the victim's car. And so we were looking at him straight away as a suspect. And we did some background checks and found that he also lived on a yacht somewhere down on the Clarence River. So, put surveillance on that yacht, kept an eye on it overnight. We went and knocked on plenty of doors and searched a lot of houses looking for this bloke who we suspected might have been involved. Had also the difficult task of notifying family. Doing death messages and that sort of thing is probably the one up there with some of the worst things you can do as a cop. So that was a pretty tough thing too, walking the family through what had happened and where we're going with it as well. But later that afternoon of when we got notified and came across the crime scene, I had forensic investigators in there, and it didn't take long to work out how our victim had died. I mean, I'd seen the extent of the injuries. They were that extensive that I couldn't work out what it could have possibly been, whether it was an axe, gun, or whatever. But they were able to pretty soon, determine that it was a firearm, and the firearm wasn't in the house. So then we had security issues. We got suspect out on the loose in a suspected stolen car with a shotgun. So then it's all, cops have got to be careful if they come across them. There's real issues with survival there. So, there was a lot. That's a lot of stuff that's going on, right? And then the next day, when I finally got home, the next night, so it was 48 hours later, that suspect actually walked into a pub at Maclean, and so we got the cops down there and arrested him. And when the forensic guys went through the house, they actually found a sawn-off shotgun stock in the bedroom cupboard of this guy that we suspected of doing it, his flatmate, along with bloodstained clothing and a whole lot of other very incriminating evidence. We thought he's pretty good for it. Got the forensic guys to check this bloke over, and they they couldn't explain it. They said, mate, we just don't think this bloke's done it. He just hasn't got enough on him. Even if he had a shower, given the crime scene, he should have something.
Even like shotgun residue and all that type of thing, like the whole 9 yards.
Well, yeah, I mean, shotgun residue, the gun residue doesn't last a long time, unfortunately. Like, you've only got a real small window before that sort of dissipates, and you can't get it. Within 24 hours, you've got to have that sorted. But still, there should have been blood and other things on him. And he clearly hadn't had a shower. He's really untidy. And I think I've been bulldozing ahead just wanting this thing cleared up. And I missed a few things. And it was actually one of the youngest detectives in our office actually said to me, do you mind if I go down and have a crack? And I said, mate, knock yourself out. And he went down and had a chat with him, and it turned out this guy that we had in our target for the murder, he'd actually been loaded up by another bloke who'd been with him that night. And after he'd committed the murder, he went and got this bloke and kidnapped him at gunpoint for another 2 days. And how he survived, I don't know, because he was the only eyewitness. We probably would have had minimal idea about this other guy. And so he kept him kidnapped for a while, and then eventually released him. Then we arrested him, and then eventually he told us about what had actually happened. And we still don't know the motive. We've got no idea why he committed the murder on this bloke. But after a month of really, really hard work, and I mean really hard work, we had phones tapped and all sorts of stuff. We eventually got this bloke and charged him with a murder, and he's a suspect for another homicide as well, and he's a bad character. But yeah, we got him in handcuffs.
You get home that evening after a couple of days to your wife. You've got 3 young boys, I think, to grab a quick bite to eat with your wife. And it's just something I wanted to sort of put the microscope on just for a moment, because you're not a robot. You can't just step through the front door of the house and pretend that this hasn't happened. And how do those two worlds sort of coexist with, Craig, the homicide detective, versus the husband and the dad to these 3 young boys? That's how does that work?
Well, in my case, it didn't. Put simply, it was an existence, and that was it. It was I just learned, and everyone's different, so I don't want to talk too generally to cover every other cop that's out there, because some people manage it really well. It depends a lot on your relationship, I think, and it takes 2 people to make a relationship work. Sometimes it takes 2 to not make it work too. But I always had a real reluctance to share a lot of, or pretty much anything that I did at work within my home environment. My home was my sanctuary, and I looked at it as my place to take refuge in after dealing with all that stuff. It was the place where I could leave it all behind and just walk through my door. But it was just, it wasn't until years later when I was doing a lot of reflection on it, it was that transitioning between being plugged in the adrenaline socket of law enforcement at that top end, you're running homicides and bikie gang jobs and stuff. Then you got to come home and try to decompress in a very short space of time and get used to all the domestic type situations that you face with at home. And sometimes I'd come home and I was so wired from the work I've been doing, I'd just have to tell the kids to leave me alone. They'd be excited to see me when I came home through the door, but I just have to tell them, mate, boys, just give me some space for a while because I was just too agitated. And also the other side of it too, and there's probably plenty of cops that experience this, is like being at the pointy end of a homicide investigation and you're just making decisions, bang, bang, bang. It's just like nonstop. Something comes in, decisive, make a decision. And you're focusing on things that sometimes are life and death. And then you come home and my wife might have asked me what I saw. She didn't see it as a mundane question, but I would see it as a mundane question about a bill that had to get paid or something to do with the kids' school reports.
Have you taken the rubbish out?
Yeah. And I'll be thinking, what are you talking about? Like, and so that causes lots of problems, as you can imagine, because she doesn't understand that. And a lot of partners of cops probably wouldn't. So I think that's why I think it's so important that not only do cops get really good training about how the job affects them over time, but also families get that training as well. They know how to react and what's going on. But I think it was just a protective factor for me. I just like to protect my house, protect myself from having to sully my house with all that carnage that I was dealing with every day. But unfortunately, I think it was also because years later, my wife and I divorced, and one of the catalysts for that is that because I never shared, she didn't really understand the level of the things I was doing. And then, not that it would excuse a lot, but, I spent most of my time when I wasn't at work, I'd go and have after work drinks with my workmates a lot because that's where I truly felt that I was most understood. The downside of that is that not that it might have made a great deal of difference, but I think if our partners understand at least like what's actually going on, what we're exposed to, it might also help understand some of our behaviours as well, I think.
If we go forward, Craig, from, the dust settles on the homicide case from Coffs Harbour, we're getting towards end of the year 2003, and there's a detective's Christmas party at the old Coffs Hotel, which got a bit colourful, to put it mildly. There's cop-friendly hotels, and there's those that aren't. And so you can go into a place, you can have a couple of beers and relax, and that's what you were doing. And then everything suddenly turned pear-shaped. Can you fill in the gaps for us there?
Yeah, well, it was only a couple of days after we'd solved that murder. It was just at one time of the year where we had an opportunity just to wind down, put our feet up and really enjoy a few beers together and chill out. So, we were at our cop-friendly pub and sitting in an outdoor area. And we'd been enjoying some beers and seafood and all those sort of things. And it was daylight savings, beautiful in Coffs Harbour that time of year. And I remember the publican told us that he was going to shut that outdoor area soon to move inside. And so an offsider of mine from Grafton and we went into the bar. We're looking for somewhere to set up, bring everyone into. We didn't know at the time, and a lot of what I'm going to share with you now is from footage from inside the pub, CCTV footage and witness statements from other people who were there. At the time, we had our backs turned, and this bloke walks in from the other bar, and he's a big muscle-bound, gym-type bloke, big neck tattoo and all that sort of thing, heavy gold chains. But he came in from behind and he put the shoulder into my mate and knocked him off balance. But that we didn't even realise it was deliberate. We thought it was an accident. And my mate just apologised to him and then walked off and to get some drinks. And he walked off, and then this bloke just yells out something pretty brutal towards him. He doesn't hear it, but I did. And I thought, what's going on here? So I leaned down and I said, mate, all he did was apologise. And with that, just got massively king hit. Came out of nowhere, got me in the jaw. I was no wilting flower, but I didn't also think myself much of a fighter. It wasn't my go. And I think he was just surprised I didn't go down. And And so I started moving. I put my dukes up and started moving towards him. And next thing you know, I was only about 2 metres from him, and point blank, he just wound up with this empty beer glass he brought in and pegged it straight at my face, like it was heading straight for my eyes. And mate, even now, I don't, for the life of me, especially considering I'd had, a fair few beers under my belt, how I got my arm up was purely reflexive, and the glass smashed on my arm before it got to my eyes. It was all such a blur, but the security ran over and jumped all over him, and he was, apparently according to witnesses, he was putting a set of metal knuckle dusters on his fingers ready to go. So it was going to get messy. But I didn't see that, and I was just looking at him, and I got dragged a different direction. I'm being tended to out in the bar that I was at. They were just trying to stop my arm bleeding. The security took him out the other bar, but there was 5 other bikies out there. They got wind of our detectives' Christmas party some time before. The whole thing was organised. They brought bikies up from Queensland. They brought one up from South Australia, Sydney. They brought and teamed up with a couple of our blokes, and they got a maxi taxi to the pub. Got the bloke to park the taxi in the back laneway behind our hotel. Gave him $50. Said, mate, wait here. What we're going to do is not going to take very long. And when I'd been glassed, they took him back out. He rejoined his mates. They went out through another door, circled back around the pub, came into our outdoor dining area, and they just went through it like a tornado. No one outside was expecting anything. They didn't know what had happened inside. And so they started throwing punches, and chairs and tables are flying everywhere. And one of my mates got knocked out, and then they laid a slipper into his head while he was unconscious. So that was a pretty low act. But, I'm sitting inside the bar, and I hear all this shouting outside, and I saw shadows through the frosted glass doors, and I thought, what's going on here? So I pushed the detective's wife who was looking after my arm. I just pushed her out of the way, and I ran outside. And once I got out the doors, I just looked up and down the street, and I was shocked into a moment of inaction. I was just looking at it. There were pitched fights up and down the street between, off-duty cops and all these bikies. And still I didn't know that they were bikie gang members at that point.
They were a member of the Finks motorcycle gang?
They were Finks outlaw motorcycle gang members. So it was really, apart from the fact it came out of the blue, it was the why was part of the shock, I think, with the whole thing as well. So once I realised, hang on a minute, mate, you've got to get in there. So I was in the fights as well. And then the uniformed cops turn up, and we managed to get all of them arrested that night, which is pretty incredible. Half of them got in the taxi and were trying to get out of there, but they got bailed up by a couple of off-duty detectives, and we got them all in the bin. But it was a real turning point for me in my career, because I'd had occasional dealings with bikies, but not at a real personal level. They really hadn't caused me any grief, and all of a sudden, these guys had just crossed a line you just do not cross. What happens at work and in the professional side of, bikies being our opposition and all that, you keep it there. When you go cops when they're off duty with their wives and families, that's a line you just do not cross. And so they crossed it, and
There's this sort of, dealing with these type of individuals, gangs and what have you, they're the same the world over, mate, and there's a begrudging respect, for want of a better term, I suppose, that goes each way. And something like this just crosses over that, attacking coppers off duty in the presence of wives and girlfriends. That just throws that code out the window. And am I right in saying that those that were involved, yourself and others, were going, okay, we need to gather forces, and you would have got support throughout New South Wales Special Operations Group, everybody else, we need to really go in there and wave the flag and get this sorted. But that was the total opposite reaction than what you got from senior management, who basically said, no, we're not going to do anything. Am I reading that right?
It was a major disappointment. There was one thing for these bikies to cross the line, but, at the end of the day, we're cops, and if you want to cross that line, you're just going to have to deal with the consequences. And for bikies, that should be basically shut down. You run out of town, you never come back, we'll shut your business, we shut everything. And that's what we expected to happen. And it was full acceptance, really, even at senior management level. I mean, originally when they heard about it, I got no doubt the senior managers thought, oh, God, the boys have been out on the piss and they've got themselves in a blue, and what do we got to clean up here? But then when they actually looked at all the CCTV footage and all the witness statements and everything came in, they saw it as clearly organised. It was nothing to do with us. It was a clearly organised attack. And I remember we had a detective's lunch about a week later, and the way I understood it was that we were going to be getting our heads together and working out what our retaliation would be. And when I say retaliation, I don't mean it that we're just going out there recklessly after revenge. It was just like, we got to take back control here. We don't let them dictate terms. It's just like, people need to learn, you want to cross that line, there's going to be a price to pay. So we went to that meeting, and then the senior managers I spoke to just said, no, we'll just let the dust settle. We'll let the court processes take their normal journey through the court. And I was absolutely horrified. I still remember the day when it all happened, that we had these discussions, and I was so angry with my boss that he'd actually made that decision. And I think that just compounded the anger that I'd already felt towards the bikies. And as a result of that, I think because there was no opportunity for us to reassert control, it was a real defining turning point in my mental health for that. Like, I already had onset of nightmares from that murder at McLean or Yamba. But then, I had this deep simmering anger because I had whatever action I thought we needed to take with these bikies, I was left unsatisfied. And I'd lay awake at night just dwelling on it and thinking over it. And then before long, I'd start fantasizing about whatever revenge we could get. And then that would start, moving into planning my own revenge, which most of the things I was thinking about at night time was stuff that would let me straight into jail. It was like things that you just couldn't do. And I had no intention of carrying any of those plans, but it was the only way I felt any relief from that anger was just thinking of the things I could do. But it was really toxic. It was really poisonous. It really affected my sleep. And then from there on into, because these guys had crossed that line, you start to wonder what else could they possibly do. And then your house doesn't feel safe, and, noises at night, you think, who's this? So it was really hard to settle. So I had a real problem with hypervigilance from those years on as well.
And I think at one point there, off duty, you walked into a known gang pub, just walked in to confront these guys, and you probably look back at that now, mate, shaking your head going, goodness me, what was I thinking?
Mate, I was truly unhinged. I was really unraveling really fast. I had the PTSD from the murder, like back to back with this stuff, and I wasn't sleeping, and I was just so angry. It was unbelievable how it was filtering into my life. And it was one night I was off duty, and this particular bikie gang some of their members had been standing over some young probationary constables who we just received at the police station, and scared the life out of them, so much so that they didn't want to even make statements about it or anything. It was terrifying for them. So, I just saw these bikies in this pub one night. They're all in their colours. There's at least a dozen of them. All the bikes were lined up out the front. And I didn't even think. It was just like straight in, picked out the sergeant arms, mate, let's go. And the place went in a meltdown. It was just, but I think the only reason I didn't get the hiding I probably could have copped was the fact that these guys just thought, this bloke mad. And so I went home and it was probably the first clear warning sign I knew I was in trouble, because that sort of reckless behaviour was so out of character for me. And so that was the first time I actually reached out to a psychologist through our EAP. And I remember I went to that appointment and I told him I was losing it. But it was one of those things where sometimes if you feel like you go to a counsellor or a therapist and you don't feel like they're going to get you, for me, I just thought this is not going to work. So I didn't go back, which was unfortunate because of what happened years later down the track. But it was like the starter's gun had just gone off with bikies for me. For all those first 15 years of my career, I hadn't had a lot to do with them. But from the moment of that attack, all I did for the next 10 years was live and breathe bikie gang. So it was only after that attack, probably 4 or 5 months later, I found myself running a big investigation into a bikie shooting up our way. It was like an assassination from senior members of one bikie gang on one of the other high-ranking members, and that involved phone taps and stuff. And I was living and breathing those bikies. That was the outcasts. I got just listening to their phone calls and listening to the way they operate gave me a real insight into the politics and the way they work, the power struggles. And, it was a big job. We had people in witness protection and all sorts of stuff while we're running that job. And it just went from one bikie job to another all the way through the end of my career.
2009, there's a case you're involved in, Strike Force Wellham. There'll be some that will have some familiarity with this. It's the Danny Wicks drug trafficking case. Now, Danny Wicks, first grade footballer for Newcastle Knights NRL team, high profile. This is a case that you're involved in for some time. Can you tell us a little bit about this one, Craig?
Yeah. At that time, I'd transferred from Grafton. I'd taken up a post as a detective sergeant leading a target action group. So basically, target action groups are, I don't know what you describe them as, like a flying squad or a anti-theft type squad where we do a lot of drug work and basically target any of the command's emerging crime problems. And drug work was a huge part of it. I had a team at Coffs Harbour and also another team at Grafton, and they'd started to get hold of a fair bit of information through informants that there was this bit of a syndicate working between Newcastle and Grafton, the North Coast, dealing out cocaine and ecstasy and amphetamines and stuff like that. And so we worked the job up, and one of the main suspects was Danny and his brother and some other associates, family members as well. And I don't know where it all started. I mean, we come into it obviously when this syndicate was well and truly established, but there was an organised crime figure down here, Macedonian organised crime figure that had somehow come in contact with Danny and became his supplier. And then Danny was transferring those drugs up to the North Coast and also supplying other teammates within the Newcastle Knights as well. And Danny at that time thought he was a bit of a gangster and a high flyer in those sort of circles. But the further we sort of dug into it, the bigger it got. We started investigating things like performance enhancing drugs and stuff like that as well. We had to bring in some detectives from some of the crime squads down here in Newcastle to join us. And so we worked it up. We worked that one for about 6-7 months, I think, at that investigation point with the phones tapped and everything. Obviously a lot longer getting it off the ground, but we had to be really careful about with the information with this because of the high profile of the targets and where we're living and working. They're country towns. It doesn't take much for word to start spreading around if something gets out. Basically, Matt and I are off-sided with that one. We worked from my rumpus room in my house. Like, we took ourselves offline, couldn't even work from the police station in the initial stages of it because we just didn't want anyone knowing what we were doing. So it was only the two of us and our commanders that knew what was going on. So we had to keep it pretty secret, and that's the way it stayed all the way through. And so we got some phones tapped, and basically it led us into it just started with some low-level drug dealing. Where it led from there, it sort of blew out quite a bit. It sort of gave me a real good insight into some of the problems associated with drug use, drug dealing and criminal associations at elite levels of professional sport. A lot of the stuff I listened to, there's a lot of stuff that I just can't share, but it really opened my eyes up to the level of these sort of problems in our community. And yeah, we eventually charged Danny. We arrested him on his way to training one morning and charged him with very serious drug supply offences. And there was about 8 all up that hit the dock with it. 2 eventually got acquitted, but all the rest of them got found guilty. And Danny and his brother went to jail for periods of time with that one as well.
In a one-team town like Newcastle, the first-grade footballers are looked up at, as almost gods in the eyes of some, and school kids and everything else. So this is a massive takedown of one of those guys. And I think I was reading, you mentioned there was that disturbing link, and you touched on it before, between illicit drugs, professional athletes, and organised crime, and how organised criminals would see these athletes as a doorway and opening into this because, they're well known, they're almost celebrity status, but they're earning good coin too as young blokes. And I think also you mentioned how at the time it was almost, confrontingly easy for these guys to get hold of, HGH or human growth hormone, which I think was found under warrant at one of the addresses, and how, this was all at the time, possibly still now, quite undetectable, and it was quite widespread in its use. And you turn the key on somebody like that, there must have been a fair few first-grade footballers feeling a little bit nervous, mate, about getting a knock on the door, I guess.
Yes, there was. Well, there was a lot of knocks on the door. It was pretty disappointing, to be quite honest, to see the sheer level of illicit drug use at that level of the sport, and the number of people that fell into our crosshairs as far as people we wanted to, person of interest for us, was like a large proportion of their playing group. And look, I think it's disappointing also. I hope things have changed. I mean, this is going back to 2009, and I hope things have changed to some degree and there's a lot more accountability. But back then it was absolutely none. There was very little oversight. It's one of those things where if me or someone else, any general member of the public walked in to a pub and saw a top-level organised crime figure, a drug dealer, if they walked up and asked them to buy like one ecstasy tablet, they'd probably get knocked out. But if you're a celebrity footballer, all of a sudden, oh yeah, I'll look after you because, you know, like you said, these footballers are cashed up. They're surrounded by cashed up friends. And they've got all this knowledge too. I mean, this is where it becomes an issue, I think, and not that this came up in our investigation, but the way I look at it is there's gambling and all sorts of things associated with professional sports these days. And once you're compromised, even just by, you know, getting involved with these people, like it's not long before they start tapping on your shoulder and asking you for a bit of information and things like that. So it might sound pretty innocuous that these guys are going out and buying cocaine and ecstasy and stuff for their personal use, but it's actually it's not, because in doing so they're really compromising themselves and the sport itself as well. They're compromising their whole profession. So yeah, it was a real education for me in that space, and you would hope things had changed, but you know, I watch the news just like everybody else, and every single time there's another drug detection or another drama with these players. It's just not NRL either. I don't want to sound like I'm bashing NRL. I'm a keen Knights supporter, but some of the administrators of these organisations really need to take some responsibility with it. So even the performance enhancing drug stuff you talked about, I mean, even that, you know, I think a big part of that, well, we had so much evidence on one particular employee of the club in the conditioning staff who was dealing performance enhancing drugs, and there was so much evidence there for it on our telephones. But back then, and I don't know if things have changed now, but there's certain criteria for what evidence you can actually use from telephone intercepts under the Act. And one of the criteria was that the actual offence you're investigating, you could only use that evidence to support that crime if that crime carried at least 3 years in jail. And back then, steroid dealing only carried 2. So it sort of showed how apathetic everyone was to the whole problem, because you don't even have adequate legislation to sort of investigate and prosecute it.
Yeah, yeah. Now, 2009, this is 6 years on from, we were chatting earlier about 2003, where through your own admission, Craig, things were coming a little bit unravelled for you, you know, with regards to the situations that you'd been in and how with the gang and that awful homicide scene, and it was all starting to mount up. This is, 5 or 6 years down the track. Where are you at now? Where's that mental health? Where's that sitting now, 2009?
Oh, mate, look, I was, I spent that whole time, basically it was a never-ending venture to try and make myself tougher, because I knew I was sort of unravelling, and the way I dealt with that was just try to toughen up more, and, I was boxing and I was doing heaps of stuff on the side, and it was, I was super fit at that time too. I really got myself back into shape, and I was pretty formidable sort of bloke, but I was really struggling. Sleep was a big issue for me. From the time of that bikie attack and the murder, for the next 8 or 9 years, I lived on somewhere between 2 and 5 hours sleep a night. And that they were on good nights. 5 hours sleep was a good night. I was just burning myself out. It was, and then going to work and plugging myself into the adrenaline socket of the work I was doing. I think a lot of the stuff I was dealing with in my private, I literally thought I was going crazy. Some of the things that would go through my head, even sitting at traffic lights on the way to work, I just think, God, what's the matter with me even thinking about things like that? No, normal people don't think like that. And I was losing it, but it was, but I was just trying to stay ahead of it by just, a couple of coping strategies. Obviously the drinking was one, but my work, I've just buried myself in the work, and I just tried to outrun it. So every time I knocked over a job like Danny's, I'd be looking for another one. So and the next one would need to be bigger again. And, I was putting myself under a massive load of stress, but that's what I wanted. I just wanted to be plugged in, get that adrenaline hit from all the stress and all the hard work demands and the risk as well. Putting myself into way too many risky situations that I didn't need to put myself in, just like in dangerous situations, just because I was so reckless to my own welfare. I didn't care. I wanted that danger. I wanted the adrenaline, and I wanted the excitement, because it sort of stimulated me and kept me going.
Coming up, an 18-month-long investigation into outlaw motorcycle gangs.
Toward the end of your time in the job, you were involved in an operation which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is you said probably the biggest operation that you had involvement in. It ran for about 18 months. This was, I think, must have started around 2010, thereabouts, concluded around 2012. Now, this was an 18-month investigation into gang activity in that, and we're back in that sort of that Clarence, Coffs Harbour command and around there. Half a dozen motorcycle gangs in the area, which for what is, goodness me, a lot of folks listening in here would not associate Coffs Harbour and areas around there as being havens for sort of motorcycle clubs activity. There was one gang that stood head and shoulders above the others with regards to creating the most serious problem, which was the Lone Wolf gang. And I think it was this gang that became the focus of this ongoing investigation that you ran, that you were involved in. And I think you were quoted as saying that you became quite almost totally consumed with this, and it's the nature of that sort of work and basically on call, 24/7. It must have continued that massive effect it was having on your mentally, home life and everything else. And can you just give us an insight to that and, listening to all these listening devices and almost immersing yourself into these gang activities?
Yeah, at that point, I'd finished at TAG, so I worked my 5 years running that office and doing all those sort of jobs. And I just had an opportunity to go back to the normal detective's office and lead investigations rather than running it. And I thought it'd be a good chance to take my foot off the pedal and start looking after myself. But it was like, trouble just finds me. And I went back to that sort of work, and it wasn't long. It was only a couple of months later, I had another murder up at Lucas. I was back into that. And then, we had this, it was one of those armed robberies that you could sort of look at, do a few peripheral, investigations into it, and then probably say, we're never going to solve this one, and just put it in a file. But what had happened was a cash and transit security guard was picking up cash from a McDonald's, and it was a lot of cash. He ended up getting robbed, and I looked at the CCTV footage, and these guys wearing balaclavas, but they were also wearing multiple layers of, you could tell, like tracksuits and stuff. In the middle of summer in Coffs Harbour, it's really hot and humid, so they were trying to cover their physiques. And just, I don't know, watch the footage, and you get to know the people that in your area and the way they walk and talk and the way they associate. There was just something about it that looked very similar to a couple of Lone Wolf gang members that we had that were pretty red hot. And we started investigating them over this armed robbery, and where that led, it just led into a whole world of trouble for everybody, for them, for me, for everyone. But the more we dug into the armed robbery, like we polished off informants and we went out there and dug up a heap of information. Like bread and butter for me as a detective was informants. Any detective worth their salt should have a good network of criminal informants. And so I tapped into mine and really started to drill down on it. And the more we looked into it, the more we saw that the bikie gang issue we had with the Lone Wolves was something we couldn't ignore. And you were talking before about country towns, you wouldn't expect it, but, Coffs Harbour and in Grafton, our command, we had 6 bikie gangs in our one command. I don't know anywhere else in Australia that's got that many in one patch. And it was mainly because of the geographics. You're halfway between Sydney and Brisbane and the Gold Coast and on a major highway. So logistically, it's a great spot for, especially when you're transporting drugs and people and stuff. And you might hear of crime waves in your command, but that's the stuff that's reported. Sometimes you might uncover another under-the-table crime wave that you don't know about. Things like home invasions on drug dealers and things that just don't get reported for obvious reasons. And anyway, these guys, it appeared to us they were on a recruitment drive and they were just getting bigger. They were the dominant gang in our command. They really were quite dangerous and quite powerful. And luckily, in some ways, there'd just been a review of staffing numbers across the state for detectives. Most commands, if they were lucky, they would have got maybe 1-2 extra spots. Based on a review of our crime stats, we got 10 extra in one go. And so that sort of shows how under the pump we would have been for a long time. And all these beautiful planets aligning at the same time. It was, so the bikies had kicked off. We'd started this investigation and we got all these new troops. And then I went to my commander and I said, mate, we've got an opportunity here. We got a full deck of troops. This is an opportunity for me to take a couple of boys offline and we work on these guys and work up a really big job. where we work it up with a view of shutting down the whole bikie gang, not just picking out 2 or 3 like we normally do and settling it down. This time, like, let's have a big picture view of this and go for the whole lot. So the plan was, and to my commander's credit, I bagged out one earlier about a lack of action. Well, the commanders at this point in time, they didn't like bikies either, and they took a lot of risk in authorising this investigation, but they let us go and they gave us 18 months, handpicked 2 people I wanted to work on it with me, and basically let us off the leash to get into it. So we got all these phones tapped. I can't remember how many there were now. It was over half a dozen, maybe closer to a dozen phones tapped. So we're listening into all their criminal conversations through phone taps, but there's a lot of work in that between 3 blokes. It was hundreds of thousands of messages and phone calls to process, analyse and work our way through. And then we also got listening devices into an apartment and into a car of one of these bikies as well, and that took a lot of manpower, even sitting there and monitoring those as well. And eventually we got undercover operatives involved in it, buying drugs off some of these bikie gang members, and we're doing raids. It was pretty full on, 18 months of investigation into that. There was a lot of risk in it as well. While we're running this job, 2 people, while we're running this job, in the first couple of months we were running it, were so badly attacked that they ended up on Westpac helicopter flights with life-threatening injuries, and we didn't expect them to live, but both of them did. And both of those attacks were committed by our targets, and we knew that. We didn't have the level of evidence we needed to lock them up, but based on all their phone calls and everything, we knew who did it. And so then we had the balancing act, like I did with that homicide I was telling you about earlier, about how long can we let these guys run? Because if someone, while we're running this job, if someone gets killed, how do we explain that? And what professional risks are we taking here? And this is where these sort of investigations, you don't see them much in regional areas. It's just we had the people to do it. Plan was, instead of just racing out every time we got a brief, enough evidence to lock someone up, instead of just racing out and doing it, because that would just put the balloon up and everything would fall apart, our plan was to, as we accrued evidence against individuals, we just file them. We just put them in the cupboard and we'll save them up for the day we're ready to wind it all up, so that we could just go out there and wrap them all up in one big net and take them out of play to cause maximum disruption. And that was the plan. But every now and then you've got these serious offences happening and you just think, how long can we let this go? Because these guys, some of these guys are unhinged and can if something happens, we're in big trouble. So it was about like identifying risk. There's a lot of risk management, putting controls in place to try to manage those targets while they were, some of them would go on 4-day drug binges and just be completely out of control. But, we did all that. There was a lot of pressure, but we got there in the end. And then we got, by the time we finished that job, we had so much evidence on all these bikie gang members. I remember brought in 100 cops from all over the place, Sydney and everywhere, Raptor squad, tactical guys. We had drug dogs, firearms dogs, all the detectives as well, 100 cops. And I still remember that we did the briefing that morning out at the airport, and we're out at the Rural Fire Service there at the airport and pre-dawn. And I still remember that morning when it was my turn. There was a couple of briefings done, and then as the leader of the investigation, it was my job to come in and wind it all up and inspire everyone to get out there and have a crack. And I still remember standing up at the podium there, and like every other time I would be excited by that. I just loved it. I loved getting up there and being the leader and driving and getting everyone motivated. But they wouldn't have noticed it. But that day, I was so flat. I could not find anything positive in what we were about to do. And so I really had to bring a lot of energy to try to fake it through it, because that whole job to that point had completely burnt me out and I had nothing left in the tank. Still remember, just before I got into my police car to go out and do my particular raid, we had 13 raids we had to do that morning, all simultaneously, all by clockwork, all pre-dawn. Before I got into the car, I looked across and I saw this convoy of police cars and trucks and vans heading out over the paddocks and the airfields, heading towards danger for my job. And there's something struck me about that. I just felt so incredibly proud of who I was that day. A detective sergeant leading, 100 cops out to go and shut down all these bikies. And it was just a profound moment. And look, it ended up being one of the most successful organised crime jobs ever run in regional New South Wales. You don't get those opportunities very often. And it was definitely one of the most successful jobs I've ever run, and it was definitely the biggest job in my career. But as it turned out, it ended up being the last as well, because talking about how flat I was and burnt out at that point, well, for the next 4 or 5 weeks, like I just went downhill real fast. And in the end, I had a big breakdown, and that was the end of me.
There's that terribly cruel irony, isn't it, Craig, that you know, I can just picture what you're saying, that you're standing there as those 100 cops are making their way towards, like you say, walking into danger, which you know, without trying to sound all melodramatic, is what coppers do on a daily basis. And they're going there as a culmination of 18 months of bloody hard grinding work for yourself and your couple of offsiders there, and that feeling of pride and everything else. But then eating away at you in the background is that sense that there's something not quite right here. There's something not quite right with how I'm feeling. And am I right in saying you're in the kitchen at home and you just literally had I don't want to be melodramatic, but you had just an absolute total mental and physical breakdown, collapse in front of your wife. Is that how it was?
Yeah, spot on. It was like basically from the day we wound that job up, every day I just went further downhill. I was spiraling so out of control, pretty much into a massive pit of depression. But I didn't really understand it still. I just kept trying to push through. You know, I still had all these we had to do mop-up operations, getting our outstanding offenders that we had to get for that job, and going to work every day just trying to push through. And it got to the end where I wasn't sleeping at all, and I was really, really unwell. And I thought, mate, now you definitely need to go and get some help. So this time I reached out to EAP, and they put me in touch with someone who was really good. And as much as I knew what she was saying to me about her assessments of me were right, I was still having trouble, like, even accepting it. And I remember, I went home from one of those appointments one night, and I used to do most of the cooking at home, and I was just cutting up veggies at the counter, chatting away to my wife, normally 1 minute, telling her about my appointment with that psychologist. And the next, all I remember is just completely collapse over the bench, bawling my eyes out. And I mean, crying so hard I couldn't breathe from it. It was just unbelievable, the level of it, and I just couldn't stop. It was just ongoing, relentless. And I was so embarrassed too for my wife to see me like that. And I got put to bed in that condition that night, missed dinner, the whole lot. Next day, way too busted to go to work, couldn't face it. So I called up sick for the first time, rang the shift supervisor, not even my detectives officer, I called the uniform blokes and said, can't come in, went off sick with the flu. So it was a mental breakdown, but I couldn't declare it, you know. And then the next day I went off sick with the flu again. And I talk about this a lot in all workplaces these days, but particularly the cops. Like, sometimes it's the little things a bit out of character for people as you know them that need you to switch on to. And my direct line supervisor, he was a detective senior sergeant, Peter O'Reilly, great bloke, and he was a really good mate of mine as well. And he knew Craig Semple, if he's dying of pneumonia, he'd be at his desk. And he's just called off sick with the flu twice in a row, and I haven't heard from him. You know, he just knew there was something not right. So instead of just picking up the phone and calling me, because I would have easily blown him off with that, he made the effort to come and see me, and we went out for a coffee, and there was no denying it because he could see it written all over me. So he talked me into going to the doctors and getting some time off. I was obviously very reluctant to do it. I didn't want to leave all my workmates with all the work that we had, but I eventually did, and that was the end. That was the end of my career. I'd never stepped foot back in a police station again as an operational detective. I was done. So basically what happened was I'd been battling one pretty serious mental illness for 8 or 9 years. And, you know, it's questionable how well I was doing it, but I was getting through, and I was still achieving big things. But, you know, a combination of all the stress that I'd been putting myself under, heaps of alcohol use, and the chronic lack of sleep, you know, basically was a perfect storm, burnt me out, and now I had major depressive disorder as well, and that was the one that really brought me to my knees. So there was a long period of time that I was in a bad way. So I was medically retired only 9 months after finishing that bikie job, which was incredibly quick. It usually drags out for a couple of years, that sort of thing. But then I was sent off to a trauma clinic at Westmead Hospital, 3 months of really intensive treatment there. I was on antidepressants, antipsychotics, and heaps of other medications. And basically I spent the next 3 years in a world of hurt, really high anxiety with PTSD, and then I crash and burn into these horrible pits of depression for long periods of time. And, mate, look, I suppose what happened there was I had a battle with suicide for that whole 3 years as well, which was really tough. And then my marriage ended up breaking down, and then I attempted to take my life, ended up in a hospital emergency ward. But obviously I'm pretty lucky because I got a second chance and I took it, and I'm going with great guns these days. But, message for cops and that might be listening now and their families, it's, for me, I remember when I was at the trauma clinic, I said to the doctor who did the 2 days of assessments with me, I said, Lucy, if I'd actually put my hand up 8 or 9 years ago when I first started having nightmares, would have really made a difference. And I was hoping she'd say no, but she said, mate, we could have probably had this sorted out for about 5 sessions. One of the barriers for me not putting my hand up all the way back then was I feared losing my career if I did. But I ended up losing my career because I didn't. I mean, a real big message for me, and it's not just cops, it's anybody battling mental health problems these days, is that you can't outrun it. The faster you run, the further you run, the harder you get pulled down in the end. When you're struggling, you've got to turn around, face it, and get it dealt with, because the earlier you get the help, the better the outcomes. And so, that's a story of consequence that I share all over Australia these days, because I really want to increase that really low levels of help seeking that we still have, not just in emergency services, but in the wider community as well. I've learnt the hard way, and I was lucky to survive it. So I hope other people don't make the same mistakes as me and try to push through.
Craig, goodness me, just again, thanks so much. There's a lot of people listening to this who will glean so much benefit for themselves, but also people listening to what you're saying will recognise possibly some of these traits in their loved ones. Their husbands, their wives, their sons, daughters, dads. As blokes, one thing and particularly in that policing environment, which is, you went through at a time, as did I, where you didn't show weakness, you didn't put your hand up for help, you just got on the drink, and the worse the work that you did, the more you drunk and the more bravado, and you talk about stuff with your mates, but oftentimes not at a level that it needed to be spoken about, because we weren't in that generation, were we, Craig, where it was, mate, are you okay? And I mean, your mate O'Reilly, I think Radar was his name for obvious reasons, who came round to see you, probably a man ahead of his time in some regards, because we don't quite know, do we, how to put our hand up, and when we do, we're frightened that it's going to show a side of us that we don't want people to see, and the coppers particularly, like other emergency services, the armed forces, the perception is that you don't show that weakness. But the irony is, of course, had you put your hand up earlier, you'd probably still be in the job today if you chose to be.
Yeah, it's like it really comes down to culture. I mean, the culture of the cops that we joined back then was that you had to be tough enough to take everything, and so that sort of meant that if you failed in that, like if you weren't able to take it, then you'd failed in that endeavour. So yeah, it was definitely not encouraged to show weakness, and we're starting to change attitudes with that a little bit in the wider community. I notice a lot of men support groups popping up all over the place now, catching up on Wednesday mornings for a coffee and then going for a swim in the surf and having a chat about things that are going on in their lives. And I think that's so cool to see. There's a lot more openness to that sort of thing these days.
Craig, you stepped away from the job, medically retired 2013, and it was a tough few years, and then you started to make your way back on that road to recovery. You got involved in getting up in front of school kids and talking to them about mental health, about your own story, and then that progressed further to, I think, 2017, starting your own business and delivering mental health training to workplaces. You've also, in your spare time, mate, you've penned a book, which I think folks listening into this who have a real interest in what you've got to say would find that a great read. I've read quite a number of excerpts as part of my preparation for this chat, and the book's called The Cop Who Fell to Earth, recently published here in Australia, and let's hope that, along with all the other work that you're doing, can continue to help folks who may find themselves in a similar spot to what you did.
I hope a lot of people enjoy it. I mean, those who are true crime buffs are going to love the first 70% of it, because there's obviously the stuff we've been talking about is like really drilled down and broken down into. It's basically written like a novel. I wanted people to feel like they're actually in the passenger seat of a police car with me and following through right at the front end. But then there's the mental health stuff at the end too, which I think is really important. And it's not just for other cops and that might benefit from it. It's also their families who can then get an understanding, because like we said, we don't talk about it a lot at home. So, hopefully I can be a voice for a lot of those emergency services personnel out there, not just police, but ambos and fireys and soldiers. look, I just hope it creates a bit of understanding out there as well for those guys and make their lives a bit easier.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search Listener Crime on TikTok or Instagram. If this content has affected you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound designed by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.